dial star 611 for assistance, as your cellular phone is not authorized for use at this time. Pour de l'assistance, veuillez composer étoile 611. Vous n'avez pas le...
Hello, podcast listener. Everything around you that you call life was made by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. The App Guy Podcasts, straight from your host, Paul the App Guy, sharing his app entrepreneur journey with you for your enjoyment. And now, Paul the App Guy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the App Guy Podcast. I'm Paul Kemp, your host, and I'm the founder of OneMob.com. And I'm just thrilled to have Jack Nutting join us today. He's the author behind some really popular books, such as Beginning iPhone Development and Beginning iOS 6 Development. But really, he's also been involved in the hugely popular apps from Toca Boca. Now, if you have kids, you'll know these apps. They are beautifully crafted and great to play. And my kids are certainly addicted to these apps. So I've given a brief introduction, Jack, but perhaps you can tell us about yourself. Tell us your story. I know that you'll be an inspiration to many app developers out there who are either thinking of getting into app development or who already have developed some apps and need extra inspiration. So perhaps you can take it away.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for the nice introduction. Well, I've been working professionally as a software developer for almost 20 years now. And straight out of college, I started working for a company doing consulting on NextStep. NextStep is the operating system that was powering the Next computer. All of this created by the company that Steve Jobs had during his middle period when he was not at Apple. And of course, that's a company that Apple went on to buy, and their software became the basis of macOS 10 and later iOS. So I've been kind of following that technology chain for really almost 20 years. And so when the iOS, when the iPhone came out and the SDK came for that, it seemed like that was a natural thing for me to start looking at. Lo and behold, it also became a very popular thing to start looking at and being able to work with. So for me, it was kind of a natural step to start working with that. And then that's also kind of at the time that I started writing about things too. I'd been doing internally mentoring and a little bit of, even as a consultant, doing some mentoring over many, many years in Objective-C development. And for me, being able to start putting that onto paper was a lot of fun. And it's a lot of work, but it's great fun. It's great to be in touch with developers from around the world every day who are reading my books and working on problems. And it's great. It feels really good to be able to help people in this way.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. And, you've, first of all, I mean, we'll get into a lot of that stuff that you mentioned, especially, the fact that you chose Steve Jobs' company Next, which would have been something that is going against the grain at the time, back in, the early, mid-90s. But, if you can tell us a success mantra, something that keeps driving you forward, what would that be, Jack?
I guess for me, the thing is that I always try and find technologies and systems that I love and just hang on to those and keep trying to make things work with them. When I started working with Objective-C in the early 1990s, people thought I was kind of out of my mind. I mean, except I obviously, I was able to get work and that sort of thing, but other technologists, other programmers who were friends of mine, they were like, wow, why are you looking at this? This seems like a dead end. Why aren't you developing Windows software? And then later in the late 90s and early 2000s, like, well, why aren't you making web applications? And just for me, I kind of found this technology that I loved. And of course, I've done other things too over my career. I spent a few years working in Ruby on Rails, and I've worked in C# and Java and C++ and all kinds of things. But I've kind of had this core that I've always returned to. It's always been kind of my native language in some sense when it comes to professional programming. And I think that's kind of the, it shouldn't be about chasing after where you think where you can make a fast buck right now. We only have this one life, and you should just spend it on doing things that really excite you and really engage you. And that's kind of what I've been trying to follow, and it's been working pretty well so far. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say that looking back, it seems like the most sensible thing to do is to follow the career of Steve Jobs and get involved with whatever he was doing at the time. But back in 1994, Steve Jobs didn't have the respect, I guess, at the time. Certainly didn't have the legacy he does now, and you got involved in Objective-C almost from the start. And so, what was it within the coding that really inspired you?
Well, I think that I got my first taste of using NextStep probably 4 years before that, when I started, like the place I went to college, Carleton College in Minnesota. We had a lab room full of Next machines. There were a few of the big Next cubes and about a dozen of these Next slabs, these sort of pizza box size computers. And I had a job working as a student system administrator using these things, which were mostly used by actually math students who were using Mathematica for drawing formulas and that sort of thing. But I just sort of fell in love with using the device. It was so far beyond what was available on either Mac or Windows in those days. And I remember that at that time trying my hand at some of the Objective-C stuff that was on there, because the development environment was there, it was built in. But I didn't really have any good tutorials, and I didn't have anyone around me in my environment who knew this stuff. And I kind of flailed around, tried a little bit, figured out a few of the basics I figured out, but not so much. And it was later when I was able to get this job doing some consulting work, and suddenly found myself with some colleagues who understood this stuff because they've been working with it for a few years, and it really it clicked for me. Within just a few days, I was like, "Wow, I got this." It just made sense to me, more than any sort of object-oriented programming I'd tried to do up to that point. This just really clicked. So that was, I think it was because I didn't have any prior experience with C++ or Smalltalk or anything that came before it. This was the first object-oriented programming that I really sunk my teeth into, and so the fact that the syntax was what is considered a little oddball today didn't really throw me off, because I didn't have anything else to go on. This is before there was Ruby or Python, before there was JavaScript, before there was Java. So Objective-C was at the time pretty groundbreaking in terms of features and in terms of what the language could do, and of course in the way the syntactically the way it's put together.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, from choosing that at an early stage, and because you chose it with a passion, you can tell that your success is working then with the likes of Toca Boca. It comes through, but I guess to help us app developers who are some of us struggling to kind of get inspired. What we really would like to do is learn about the failures that you've had during your time as an app developer. Working with Objective-C. Are there any stories you could tell us from those early days where you did actually, fail, and what were the lessons learned during those times? Well,
let's see. I think that most of the times that I failed at something, I've been able to usually turn it into some kind of success anyway. Most of the time when you're doing development work, say if you're doing development work for a client or for your employer, failures are just sort of missteps on the way to getting it right. So each time you make a mistake and deliver a product that's wrong in some way, that's going to help you actually later realize what the right product is supposed to be anyway. I would say that my biggest failures when it comes to actually delivering and producing apps just on the iOS platform is perhaps failure to be prepared for success when it happens to come along. So one of my very first iOS app that I put out was a game called Scribbattle. This is in early 2009, and I had the great fortune that the light version of Scribbattle, which was a free app, climbed the charts, and so it hit like the number 1 and number 2 spot in every app store of the free apps there for a period of a few hours essentially on a particular day in March of 2009, and what I had not done was I hadn't really, I had kind of made a game, then I made a light version of the game to see how it went. And when it started to go really well, I wasn't really prepared for that. If I had been able to have, say, a second app ready to go at that point, that I could have, put that app in front of all the new users, so that I could sort of lead them into sales of perhaps a second app, that would have been worth gold. And that's what I did not have. I just wasn't thinking of it business-wise to sort of have kind of a pipeline of things ready to go. So by the time I came out with the second app, it was really pretty much too late. So my initial app success had kind of peaked and died off at that point. So I think that's sort of, I mean, you have to be ready to grasp opportunities that can turn up. So that's one. I mean, I'd say my biggest that's sort of the biggest failure that I can think of off the top of my head is kind of more a business failure than a technology failure. Because technology failures, that happens. I mean, every program has bugs and everyone has bad releases, and it just sort of happens. But it's a matter of trying to always continuously improve things and try and step up your game every way you can.
That's terrific. How did you learn from that? What did you do then, I guess, following the release of Script Battle to learn from that failure?
Well, I think I learned that putting an app out is not necessarily the road to like earning a lot of money on it. So from having a successful app, of course that led to other things. That helped me get my job at Toca Boca, I'm sure, to some extent. That helped lead me into other kinds of work and helped. I mean, everything you do that is any kind of success builds up your resume, builds up your sort of credentials for what you're able to accomplish. But that if you want to have a business making apps, you can't necessarily count on one app being put. You can't count on being able to put out one app and say, this is going to be my huge hit, and I'm going to be rich from this. If you look at something like Rovio, I think Angry Birds was their 50th game or something. I was not on iOS. They were most of the games were Java mobile games, I believe. But they didn't have any big successes until suddenly they had one big one. And I think similarly, the way to build a business out of iOS is to think about the long term and think about building up a portfolio of products. Whether it's games or whether it's music applications or whatever it is you're working on. It's typically not necessarily going to be enough to have sort of one product. You kind of have to think about having products that can lead into other products.
This is great because I'm writing a few of these things down, Jack, and there's so many things that are coming into my mind. Firstly, I've had an app where I've submitted it to the App Store and put in a light version and a pro version, and Apple don't like that anymore. They disallowed it. Have you got any suggestions for app developers that obviously that is one way of making money, is what used to be one way of making money, where you put in a light version and then a paid pro version? Did you got any suggestions, given that I think Apple probably don't like that anymore?
I guess I haven't since I haven't submitted two apps in tandem that way in a couple of years, so I'm not really sure. But I mean, the other way that I guess is the preferred way that Apple prefers you to do it now is to have one app that you release, and that app can have in-app purchase to enable the full set of features. So you deliver one app that everyone can use and it's free, and you try and set a feature set that is good enough, but then you can hint at more things. Say, by the way, if you want to do this also, then pay this one-time fee and you get the full app. I think that in-app purchase has kind of a bad name in some ways. I mean, people think about these apps that, some in-app purchase is all about consumables. You're buying tokens for use in a game that are going to let you do things in the game faster. But once you've used them up, you have to buy more if you want to keep going at that speed. But I think for an application that you say like a light version and a pro version that is, maybe it's a productivity application, or even it could also be a game where you want to have the basic thing to show off as more of a trial version and the full game for a one-time fee. I think that's totally acceptable and a reasonable use of the technology. And I think that people nowadays understand that pretty well. The downside can be that actually these days it can be very often assumed that any free application, you think in the back of your head, okay, it's free right now. What are they going to try and sell me later on? I can have a tendency to say, okay.
The freemium model is people are getting very suspicious of that now, aren't they? Especially if you have kids.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, every time one of my kids comes and says, "Hey, Dad, look, can I buy this?" It says, it's just this amount of money for the Christmas pack for this game. It's like, well, let me think about it. Come back to me tomorrow. I'll have time to think about what it is. And because some of those some of those games, again, they might be a thing where it is a one-time fee for a chunk of functionality that you can keep using forever, and then that's fine, especially if the app was free to begin with. It's not much to complain about.
I mean, just going back to Script Battle, Jack, because I'm interested in the Lite versus Pro. Do you remember the percentage of the number of downloads of Pro compared to Lite? For example, were people willing to jump up to the Pro version? Do you remember the percentage that were?
I do remember the percentage because it was absolutely miserable. I think at the peak of Scribbattle Lite's success, when I had on the order of a couple 100,000 downloads a day, about 0.5% went and bought the full version. So I mean, it was something. I made a little bit of money. I made a nice little chunk of money in 1 month, and then I kind of took about a year to double that because the sort of long tail set in. And now these days it's dwindled down to basically nothing because most of my work has been focused on other things. So yeah, it was a pretty miserable percentage. I'd say actually that in terms of raw percentages, right now it's probably a little bit better. Right now I'm probably at about 2 or 3%, but we're talking such small numbers that it doesn't really matter. I have probably less than 100 downloads a day of Scribbattle Lite. So, if I get 30 downloads of the free version and one purchase of the paid version, well, that's 3% or whatever. So it's better percentage wise, but much worse in terms of the bottom line. So I think.
Do you think from your experience that the App Store people are more willing now to spend money because of I guess a suspicion about the freemium model and realizing that nothing really truly is free?
Yeah.
Do you think that people are more willing to pay for apps?
I think to some extent they are. I think this is something that we definitely found within Toca Boca, where we decided from day one we are not going to have in-app purchases. Later on, I think we began to talk about maybe doing it in some cases, but it would not be consumables. It would be sort of a one-time activation. And I'm not with the company anymore. But as far as I know, they haven't gone down that road. We decided to sort of say we're delivering premium applications, and where premium means it costs $2 or $3, it's a pretty cheap premium. But we decided that instead what we would do is we would have some free apps. So there are some Toca Boca apps that were always free. And then occasionally other apps would be free for a limited amount of time to try and help draw more people into our sort of system. And then what we had is that, as you've seen the apps, they have a small badge in one corner of the screen when you start up. So that little badge can show you when there's a new app that comes out. So it's very low key. We never did a lot of sort of heavy selling of anything. There were never any pop-ups of any kind that tried to get you to buy anything. It was only if you actually tapped on something. And then towards the end of the time I was there, we actually added into all of the apps where a small child can't even bring up the thing to try and buy more stuff because you have to tap, and then a little panel pops up that says, if you want to go to this, to look at our other apps, swipe left with 2 fingers or up with 2 fingers or whatever. It's kind of randomized. And this is something to sort of prevent even the hint of a possibility of people accidentally buying stuff that they didn't want to buy. And so in spite of all this, in spite of the, we were always very careful about not pushing people anything they didn't want to be into, and being very clear about that this, we have a few free apps and mostly premium apps. Sales were great, and the sales were even great, we found, on Android, especially relative to what I thought when we started launching Android apps. I was actually the first to admit I was not a believer that this was going to go anywhere, because conventional wisdom at the time was, and I guess still is, that Android users don't buy software. But we've found that they pretty well did. I mean, I'm sure we had some help that our first releases were pushed by Amazon, because we released for the Kindle Fire first, and so we got nice placement on their storefront. It didn't cost us anything, so that helped, I'm sure. But we had it works. I think that people are ready to buy software when it is quality software. And I think that looking back on my situation with Scribbattle and Scribbattle Lite, again, when you have the extremely popular free applications, you're kind of tapping into a different market. There's the marketplace of people who want to get something for free, just for free, and that's it. And there's a marketplace of people who are willing to spend $1 or $2. And I think you have to look at, these are two different marketplaces that you only have one interface to them. You can't tell who is who when someone downloads an app. But by trying to sort of make a message about what you're doing, you can try and come into the right place, so that if you want to make software that is going to cost something, you can't always just appeal to the people who just want freebies.
I'm certainly learning a lot from this discussion, and hopefully the audience are taking away some things as well. And what I'm learning is that, there is perhaps a new way of making money on the iOS store, and especially into developing apps, and that's with brand recognition. So delivering, like Toca Boca, delivering a really killer app, something that people fall in love with and reinforces your brand, and then having that as the catalyst for driving downloads of paid apps. So I know from certainly my own experience of Toca Boca, where we actually loved the first game that we downloaded, and so much so that we typed in the search engine Toca Boca and found all the other apps, and just pretty much bought every one based on the trust that you'd built up in the first game that we played. And so I think that's probably something I'm taking away from this, is that it's to do with the brand and being honest and genuine with the app, not trying to get cheap downloads or cheap clicks or get paid with advertising, and letting the brand promote itself.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's the sort of proposition that we tested within Toca Boca, and I think that we proved that, at least for us, for what we were doing, it seemed to work. It made a lot of sense.
And it's wonderful to talk to an author, an app developer, especially someone who's had 200,000 downloads a day with their first app. I mean, did you put any advertising on that? Have you had any experience with advertising with large numbers?
I did put advertising into it, but not then. So I mean, this was 2009, in the beginning of 2009. It was early days, and so there wasn't really this whole system of third-party advertising. It wasn't quite as prevalent as it is today. So I'm sure there were companies who were selling ad space at that time, but I didn't come into contact with any of those until maybe a month or two later. So by the time I put out a release that had ads in it, the amount of revenue that I got from that was not very much. These days, since there is still some user base that still plays the game and still sees some ads, I'd say right now, the amount of money that I earn from ads probably is a little bit more than the amount I earn from sales. But then again, the amount I earn from sales of Scribbattle are extremely low right now. So it's 6 and 1 and a half dozen the other. I think that it can be a good way forward. I think that people are used to seeing ads in apps now, including in games. There are so many free games that have a banner in them that I think that people don't necessarily mind. I tried not to do that. So like in my apps, in my games that I have out there with ads in them, I don't have on screen during gameplay ads. I have ads that appear as interstitials. So between levels, an ad will pop up sometimes, or when you just complete a game, an ad will pop up rather than in the game. But I mean, there are a lot of ways to do it, and I think consumers seem to be pretty accepting of this nowadays. But again, I unfortunately got my ads in too late. I sort of missed my potential gold mine there in terms of getting hundreds of thousands of impressions a day. I sort of missed that boat.
So I'm taking away that ads are one route to I guess making money from apps, but it's 6 to 1, half a dozen to another, and you've either got to go down the paid route and build up the honesty and the brand recognition, or build up the downloads and put ads in there, but making sure that they're not taking away too much from the user experience. Do you think Android, it's better to have ads on Android apps rather than iOS apps? I mean, we all know the myth out there that, what seems to happen is that people do say that iOS apps are easier to kind of have as paid apps, and Android, it's easier to go down the route of advertising. Is that true on your experience?
hard to say. The only apps that I've been involved with on Android at all are really Toca Boca's apps, which do not contain ads. So I don't really have any direct experience. All I know is, probably the same kind of vague rumors that other people have probably heard about that. I don't remember. I think it was also again Rovio who was talking about at some point that they had released Angry Birds on Android for free with in-app ads instead, and they had huge amounts of downloads on Android, of course. But the amount of money that they actually made off of ads was nowhere near what they had made off of sales on iOS. So it's sort of, I think that's a case where I think maybe they made the wrong judgment call. I think that maybe that on the strength of Angry Birds having done so well on iOS, they probably could have sold a lot of Angry Birds on Android instead of going the free route at that point. So I don't really know. I'm not sure that. I think that ads on either Android or iOS will probably do similarly, and I think the question is more: will this app sell as a premium app instead? Would it sell better or not than the ads are going to make me? And it's really hard to know. And as you're aware, a lot of the freemium apps rely on a different model where the app is free, and then they're counting that a few users are going to pay again and again and again and again for these in-app consumables. And that's that's a whole different beast. And it's hard to say whether that works as well or better on Android than on iOS. I just really don't know.
Mm. I've got an interesting question for you, Jack. If you were to sit down and meet Jack Nutting of 20 years ago, when you were just starting out, what advice would you give to him? What would you, in terms of, what would that talk be like? What advice would you give to yourself of 20 years ago in regards to app development?
Good question. I mean, let me think. What would I say to myself? I guess I would want to tell myself to pay a little bit more attention to the details. So, especially looking back at the earlier parts of my career, I can certainly see situations where I kind of let myself glide through some situation that instead of really grabbing it by the horns and saying, I'm going to tackle this and really understand this and really get better at doing this particular thing. Where I kind of let myself say, okay, I know enough about this to just get by, and that'll have to do for now. I think it would have, the things that I've learned in the meantime, I feel like there's always a threshold or there's a ramp up to learning any technology, anything you want to learn, and it can be easy to sort of stand in front of this thing and say, I don't know how to climb this hill. But then once you eventually have to climb the hill for some reason, you look back down behind you and say, that wasn't so bad, and the view from up here is so much better. I should have climbed this hill a long time ago. I feel like if I could tell myself one thing, it would be to sort of grab on to these new technologies that you see and that you find interesting, and really dig in and figure out how they work and how to use them to your advantage.
Well, that's great advice, and I, as an app developer myself, I can really take on board what you're saying there. I do, in my own experience, take shortcuts, and sometimes I am more focused on getting the app out than actually learning the code behind it and trying to improve the app, and really, I guess, taking the easy road. And then you release the app and you get a very small number of downloads, and you kind of get a little bit depressed and carry on to the next app. And so I can really hear what you're saying there in terms of focusing on the detail and
because I think
not taking too many shortcuts.
I think when you really dig in, that's when you also begin to see new possibilities. When you really understand the technology more, you can say, okay, now I get how this works. Now I see how I can apply this to another idea or to another project that I've been thinking about. Or you have it in your back pocket for the next time something similar comes up. You say, oh, I know how to solve that. And I know more than just how to sort of, apply a coat of paint on it. I know how it actually works. I know how to really make it top notch.
And Jack, is there anything you're working on right now that's really exciting you? What's going on you've got involved with at the moment, right now?
Well, right now, this past summer, I switched jobs. I started working for a consulting firm called ThoughtBot. Thoughtbot is mostly doing Ruby on Rails programming, but also more and more iOS work, which is where I came on board. And so we have a number of exciting things. Thoughtbot has a lot of online content for learning about software development. It's a lot about web development, Ruby on Rails in particular, but also other things, web design, CSS, and whatnot. I'm working also on some iOS content, which is coming up pretty soon. I'm gonna have a video version of an iOS developer workshop that I've been doing this live workshop a few times a year for a couple of years, and now I've made sort of a video version of a big chunk of it, which kind of narrows it down into a nice sort of compact thing that you can sit and watch and pause and backtrack and laugh at my mistakes. And so I'm pretty excited about that coming out pretty soon. Otherwise, apart from that, I'm really happy to be at Thoughtbot. It's a great company. You should check us out if you're interested in looking, and if you need some work done on building a system for your new startup, then you should check us out. Apart from that, I have plans on making my own sort of new little product launches of my own. I've been thinking more and more about making more of my own games. So while I was working at Toca Boca, all of my game programming activity was on Toca Boca stuff, obviously, which was great. Now that I'm not there, I'm still thinking about games, because games are what drove me into computer programming. I'll admit that, starting in the early '80s. So I'm thinking about trying to make some more games, and I'm not going to try and do anything near the scale of what Toca Boca has done, or probably not even approach the quality of what Toca Boca has done, because I'm a one-man guy, and this is in my spare time, really. But I want to make some. I really like kind of retro style games that focus on a core play element that can be a lot of fun and a lot of challenge. And so I've got a few things in the pipeline that I'm hoping to get pushed out this wintertime. So we'll see how that goes. And I'm going to try and set things up a little better, a little smarter, so that this time, if I do manage to have some success, I can hopefully funnel the success of one app into getting people to download another app. Or two, or three.
Great.
We'll see how it goes.
And you mentioned Thoughtbot, and all the links to how to get in touch with you, or how to reference the things that you mentioned during the podcast. I'm going to put on a link on the website so people in the audience can find out about you and get to you. What else? The other thing I was going to ask is, what's the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I've ever received. Well, there was a guy I used to work with at my first consulting job, actually, and he was kind of an older fellow. He was pretty near retirement at that point, I'm pretty sure. And I guess I don't have a pithy quote summarizing his advice, but what I always admired about this guy was that he always kept his cool. So no matter how much people were freaking out about a release coming up late, or about some technology not working, or about someone being unhappy about something their boss said, or whatever, he just had this approach of just always saying, this seems really important today, but in a month it won't seem that important at all. In a year, you won't even remember it happened. So just sort of, take things one step at a time, one day at a time, and keep going forward until you can work through your problems. And the things that you think are huge impediments right now, you'll get past them, and you just don't worry about it so much. And so I try and sort of follow that advice, and deal with problems, take care of situations, but not let it consume me when things are going badly.
Great advice. And for an app developer who's been involved in some really successful apps, are there any habits that you could share with the listeners here? Habits that really help you in your app development journey?
One of the big ones I would say is learn to use version control systems of some kind. Git is the preferred thing these days. And you don't have to become an expert in every corner of how Git works. But just in terms of being able to sort of look back at what you've been doing and track down where you've made a mistake. I first started, the first version control system I used was in the late 90s, this thing called CVS, which was, it was pretty poor. And at the time we sort of started using Subversion shortly after that. And these days, it's almost now Git all the time. And the difference of going from not using version control systems to using version control systems is just night and day. And the more you use it, the more you understand it, the more you realize, wow, you can so easily pinpoint where things go wrong. You can check in, especially with Git. I love the fact that in Git you can do commits again and again. You can do 100 commits a day, and there's essentially no overhead to doing it. There's very little drawback. So anytime you feel like I've made a good chunk of progress here, you do a commit, and then you're done with it. And later, if you happen to screw things up, you can go back and see where you were. And by the way, Xcode these days has, I think, quite nice Git integration. You can very nicely see, you can track changes between two versions of files. They have a nice little sort of slider, like a time machine-like slider that lets you kind of look at what you have today on the left and what you had 2 weeks ago on the right, and just pull the slider up and down and see where you're at 1 week ago or 3 weeks ago or whatever. I think that for me, once I started really using that, was pretty revolutionary in terms of being able to know what I've done and keep track of what I've done.
Yeah, because trying to track back bugs is a nightmare for all of us. And
I know that when
I know there are app developers out there, I'm sure, that are even using things like just Word or Notes or Google Docs, and pasting in their code. And
oh, sure, yeah,
I guess it's a good habit to get into.
Or having multiple files. This class is called viewcontroller.m. The previous version is called viewcontroller_old.m. You got viewcontroller_old_2.m. So and this is something that I used to see people doing, and I always knew it was bad. But before using version control, it was not necessarily always clear what else am I going to do. I worked at companies where I'm not going to name names, and it was a long time ago. But I came into this place, and their only version control was that once a day, everybody's home directory was backed up. So if you wanted to see what you did yesterday, you could open up the zip file containing yesterday's contents. And it was so primitive. Like at that point, I at least started using CVS for all my own projects and for some of the work I've been doing. And at that point, I felt like I was stepping into a caveman's hut or something. It's so liberating because you can do your work and save your changes, and that you're safe. You can always go back to what you had working a half an hour ago if you accidentally mess things up.
A good lesson to us all. Version control. That's certainly something I'll be getting more and looking more into.
And I know that whenever I these days interact with someone, say who's not a programmer, who is perhaps delivering some resources for me for a project, delivering graphics or audio files or whatever. These people who are more in media production side of things don't typically think in these lines, and so it's not uncommon that they'll get an email from someone saying, "Hey, here's a batch of sounds," or here's today's recording, and it's called recording.wav. And the next day they say, "Oh, I've been doing some edits. Here you go," and it's recording_2.wav. And it's it's essentially it's a new version of the same file. It doesn't need to have a different file name, but obviously that's the way they're tracking it, is that they make a copy on their hard drive, give it a new number, and it's a very primitive way of doing things that you're totally freed of that if you're using version control.
A great habit. One of the things as well, do you have any internet resources that you just are in love with?
The biggest and best is probably Stack Overflow for me these days. I answer questions when I can, but or when I have the time. But I use it to find answers to questions a lot. And unfortunately, it's such a popular site that it very often ranks highly on Google. So you don't even necessarily need to go into Stack Overflow to search for answers. You can find them right there. Otherwise, what else? There's a wiki that I used to write on a fair amount and be involved with. It's called CocoDev. I wonder if it's still around. CocoDev.com. And this was something that was in the early days of... is it there? It seems like it's not there. Now someone's got it. Never mind. I won't talk about that. We had a nice wiki that was, people kind of wrote stuff that was, if someone had an issue about some class. It was kind of a way to have a discussion about the various classes in Cocoa and how things worked and all sorts of stuff. But I won't dwell on that since the site is no longer there. Stack Overflow is great.
Yes, the way I use that is through Google, as you say. I mean, it really is always pretty much the top search, certainly in the first 2 or 3. And so you don't even need to be registered to look at the solutions to most of the problems that you're kind of searching for.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots there. And then also, if you're not looking for a specific answer, but want to have kind of some tutorials and walkthroughs, Ray Wenderlich is a great website. He started off mostly focused, I think it was mostly on games and Cocos 2D, but it's really expanded, and he has a lot of writers, and there's a lot of great stuff on there. So as soon as any new technology comes up from Apple, within a few weeks, these people have covered 90% of it, and there's a lot of material there. Apple themselves have been doing a great job, I think, of documenting their new stuff, and especially nowadays that they release their materials from the WWDC immediately and for free to everyone who's signed up as a developer. It's utterly fantastic. There's also a nice thing called ASCII WWDC, where people have actually written transcripts of all the talks from this year's WWDC event. That's a very nice thing because it's text, so it's searchable, and you can. Because sometimes you'll be I know usually in June and July I sit and watch all these videos. And later I'm thinking, geez, who was it? There was some video where someone was talking about how this view transition thing worked, and I don't remember where it was. With ASCII WWDC, you can actually search that stuff now. That's pretty nice.
Right, that is good. I mean, for those listening, if you go into your iOS developer console, then I think in the resources section, there's all the videos of WWDC, and I know that I need to watch more of those. I do get completely engrossed in when I watch them, but it's making the effort to get through them all because there's so many. But it's a great resource. So before we say goodbye, Jack, is there anything else that you would like to mention that you think would inspire those developers who are needing inspiration and those thinking of getting into app development? What would you say, and anything else that you would bring to the discussion here? I
guess that the main thing I would want to say is that I would hope that people who are getting into this are getting into this because they are really excited about the technology and they found something that they love to work on. There is kind of a perception among lay people that app developers, well, those are people who are looking to make a quick buck somewhere. And I've even had this among potential customers. I had one potential consulting customer who said, we've talked to a lot of guys, and they're all these, 22-year-old kids, and they look like they're just want to make a buck on this. Why are you developing apps? Like as if I was stepping into some sort of weird ghetto, being involved with some shady characters, But it's sort of, and I think I don't have that impression from people that I meet, but I think that there is an impression, and I wonder where it comes from. But I think as long as if you're building applications because you're building something that you want to have for yourself, or you see a perceived need for this and think, man, I've got the solution to somebody's problem, then I think you really can't go wrong. I think, find the technology that you want to work with and find the problem you want to solve and go for it.
Scratching your own itch, that's one thing that comes to mind when you... So how would people get in touch with you? What's the best way of contacting you?
If you just want to see what I'm up to, you can follow me on Twitter @JackNutting. I also have a blog where I write, unfortunately, quite infrequently, called nuthole.com. Otherwise, you can drop me an email, also jacknutting@mac.com. I'm always happy to talk to people and answer questions and help people out if I can, so feel free.
Well, Jack, all it leaves me to say is I've been inspired from your story as an app developer and the journey, and certainly I'm going to take on board some of the things that you mentioned during the discussion there, and it's been a very pleasant discussion with you, so I appreciate your time, and it just leaves me to say goodbye for now, and hopefully I'll have a chance to speak to you again sometime soon.
All right, goodbye, Paul. Thanks for today. It's been great. I've had a lot of fun. Love to talk to you again in the future at some point.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode, and if you do have any ideas on who we should interview, please send that email to info@onemob.com. That's info@onemob.com.